Good morning, everyone. Welcome for the second day. And it is my great pleasure to present to you Daniel Faria. He is the scientific coordinator of this program. Daniel is a senior researcher at LASIS, Faculty of Sciences, and an invited assistant professor at the Universidade Católica Portuguesa. He obtained a PhD in bioinformatics from the University of Lisbon in 2012. He joined the initial team of Elixir Portugal, Biodata PT, back in 2015, and has been a very active member since then. His research interests are centered on knowledge presentation, data management, and bioinformatics. Daniel, it is really a great pleasure to have you with us. You have the floor.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone. Let's start by doing a small recap of what we talked about yesterday. Okay, introduction to today as well. So yesterday we did, in the morning, mostly an overview of what it means to be a data steward, about what the current policies are in terms of fair and open science in Portugal and in Europe, the requirements of the funders. And then in the afternoon, we delved into data management plans. So one of the first chapters in data management with a practical exercise. So we got your feedback from yesterday. Most of you seem to have enjoyed the data management plan exercise and felt like you had acquired some useful knowledge about data management plans. That was the main thing. Some of you also felt like you had learned about fair data. Things that you didn't understand fully, metadata is one of them, and we will address them today. Okay, we will have a lecture devoted in large part to metadata, as well as the first session about fair data will also cover these aspects in some detail. Okay, a few of you didn't fully understand questions about data management plan exercise, step 4, and when to do a data management plan and what's the status on machine actionable data management plans. So we hope to clarify some of these questions throughout the course. But in general, I think the feedback was good for yesterday. And so for today, the plan is to start with a presentation that I'll be doing about fair data. So this will be a very open session where I welcome discussion from all of you. Okay, there will be moments where I ask all of you to voice your opinions. We'll be talking more about the why of FAIR principles, the why of open science, and starting a little bit on the how. And then the rest of the day will be mostly devoted to the how, so to how to archive and share and publish data, how to organize and version and document data, and learn a bit about what metadata ontologies are and how to use them. Okay, and that will be it for this first 2 days of the course. So now I'll give the floor to myself and move on to the first presentation. So, okay, can you see my slideshow?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay. So yesterday we learned all about the FAIR principles in some detail. Okay, we learned that they are. Let me just shift the Zoom commands. I'm sorry, I hate having the Zoom commands overlapping the presentation. So we learned all about the FAIR data principles. There are 4 principles: findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability, and they are detailed in 15 guidelines. And the aim of these principles is to facilitate knowledge discovery in data-intensive sciences, mainly through enabling data reusability and data accessibility. Before we actually proceed, I think it's critical that we're all on the same page, so we all understand what we're talking about when we're talking about concepts that we use every day, namely concepts of data, information, and knowledge. So these are concepts that we often use without thinking, and the distinction between them is sometimes fuzzy, but I think it's important to distinguish between them and understand what we're talking about when we're talking about data, when we're talking about information, and when we're talking about knowledge. And so without further ado, I welcome your notions on these concepts. So what do you think is data? What do you think is information? What distinguishes the two? What is knowledge? Please don't be afraid to speak up. This will be a very boring presentation if I don't get your input. There are no wrong answers here, okay? Everyone has their own notions of these concepts, and I welcome yours.
Well, if I may.
Okay, sorry. I should say, for whenever there's a group discussion, feel free to speak up if no one else is speaking up, okay? You don't have to raise your hand.
Okay, if I may, what I understood from reading some background information that you recommended in the reading list, well, data is from a biobank point of view is clinical data, personal data that we collect on patients or participants in any clinical study, for example. Knowledge, I remember the example you gave in some past presentations about the boiling water, that you use it for cooking or you don't put your hand in, that kind of examples that I got from your presentation. As you said, there are no wrong or right answers.
But you already saw some of this presentation. So
yeah.
This presentation is a bit shifted in perspective. So I already gave this sort of talk from a researcher's perspective, trying to convince researchers of some of the motivations behind FAIR principles and open science. Here I'm going to shift the perspective a bit because this is geared towards data stewards, but it is your role as a data steward to be able to have these same discussions with researchers that you wish to support. Okay, so it is critical that you're very comfortable with these concepts. Okay, so, Anna, I think you're muted.
Sorry, Daniel. Monica wanted to step in, perhaps take a chance.
Yeah, please moderate, because in speaker view I don't see everyone that has
I will, don't
hand.
worry.
My opinion is almost the same as Saba. Yesterday in the presentation you also showed the difference between data and information, and I think that you said that information or knowledge is data in context or treated data in a way. So I think we can use that as to distinguish between data and information.
Anybody else has a different point of view or something to add?
Hi, Daniel.
Yes.
Basically, as far as I know, data is raw data, so it's just information not organized, basically. So information are organized, data are not usually. So this is the most generic.
So I would not distinguish between raw data and processed data. They're both data.
They are both data, but one has information. Information is organized, basically.
Okay. Would you say it's just a matter of organization?
Not just, but that can be the biggest difference between both, between them.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
Oh, hello, good morning. I can give my opinion about this. I think data is what we can get, and this is my perspective of researcher, what we can get from experimental that we plan to do. The information is what we get from that, and how we use the data to take some information from that. And also the knowledge is what we can interpret, our interpretation about that information. So it's my point of view.
Okay. Thank you very much. So your views are very similar to mine. So in computer science, typically, or information sciences, we typically consider data or a datum to be an atomic fact or piece of information. Okay, could be 0 degrees Celsius. Data, so the plural would be a tuple of datum about the subject. Okay, this for data that is tabular in format. Obviously, could have a data file, but it's no different. It's still a tuple of data. Only part of the data is binary. Okay. You could have an image file, for example. Again, the same part of the data is binary. You could have a video, part of the data is binary, but it's still a tuple of attributes about some subject. And then you have a data set when you have a set of interrelated data tuples. It could be different aspects of the same subject or the same subjects. It could be the same aspects of related subjects. So it depends on the context of how and why the data was gathered. So, but there's a key step to going from data to information. We only can obtain information from data if we have context. So I don't think organization is that important. It is important for sure. Your data needs to be structured in such a way as that you can figure out what the data actually is, but you need context to be able to interpret the data. If you just have a tuple of attributes, you can't really interpret it. Okay, you can, because this is fairly intuitive, but in principle you would need to know what the subject of the data is, what are the headings of these tuples, so what is the key for this. So it would be a chemical code, a melting point, and a boiling point. And then you also need to know under which conditions this is true. Okay, how is this determined? How was it measured? And under which conditions is this valid? Okay, and it's valid at atmospheric pressure if water is relatively pure. Okay, and to provide context, we need metadata. Okay, and metadata is just data about data. Okay, things like who produced the data, when the data was produced, what the data is about, why was the data produced, how can it be used. Okay, how can you interpret it also? How was it produced? Okay, using tools, software, what methods? All questions that can be answered by providing metadata. And we think about metadata as something purely computational, but we can go back to the picture here to library cards in libraries. These are essentially metadata about the books in the library. Okay. The library, the object of the library is to contain books. So this is not data, this is metadata about the things that are in the library. And knowledge, as Ricardo said, there is essentially understanding of information, something you take out of information. And I would add that it is actionable. If it's not actionable, it's not really knowledge. Okay. Other people might differ, okay, especially historians and people that work in humanities might differ about what consists of knowledge or not. But for me, knowledge is something that enables you to act differently upon your world in a way that changes your quality of life or the understanding you have of phenomena around you. Okay, and for the example we've been discussing, it could be simply just that boiling water allows you to cook food, or that boiling water is not something you should dip your hand on because it will be very hot. So if you think about a mind map of these, you can think about metadata as a subclass of data. Okay, keep this in mind. Metadata is also data. Okay, but it's data that describes data. Okay. And then to have information, you need to have both data and the description of what the data is. Okay, so it stands in the intersection of data and metadata. And you arrive at knowledge through cognition. Okay. So if you look at it in the traditional value and meaning pyramid, you see data at the bottom with the least value. Information has more value and more meaning, and knowledge has the most value and meaning. Okay, so my next question is then, what is scientific knowledge? How do we generate scientific knowledge, and how do we share scientific knowledge? Again, I welcome your views on this.
I guess is the interpretation of the knowledge, something like that, no? It's
But what qualifies knowledge as being scientific?
Well,
If I may,
I guess all the scientific community understands what the meaning of that, the science behind it. Well, it's hard to. Let me guess. Let me think in a better.
okay, if I may,
Yes, of course.
I would say that this is knowledge, as described before. Only it is obtained through the scientific method.
Yes.
It is garnered through the scientific method.
I fully agree. And what is the scientific method?
Well, it's that method that we all know that starts with observation, placing hypotheses, testing them, observing the results, and then generating the knowledge, depending on whether the hypotheses are verified or not based on the data.
Okay. And how do we share scientific knowledge?
Usually through peer-reviewed publications, although that's by far not the only way.
Can also do science communication to spread scientific knowledge.
So I fully agree with Francisco's view. So scientific knowledge is knowledge acquired through the scientific method. Again, I'm biased. I would wonder if something not acquired through the scientific method is actually knowledge, but don't mind me. So it's based on the formulation of hypotheses that are done by induction. So you start by observations and induct hypotheses to explain those observations, and then you test those hypotheses by testing deductions that you draw from the hypotheses. And typically this involves the production and analysis of data. Okay, so you generate data to test your hypotheses or to test some corollary that you derived from the hypothesis, and then validate, or rather you cannot validate the hypothesis, you can disprove it. If it stands to the test and it's not disproven, then you have some, let's say, weak validation that it holds, at least under the constraints of your experiment. And yes, scientific knowledge is essentially still published through peer-reviewed articles, both in scientific journals or in scientific conferences. Okay, in conferences you usually also have the opportunity to speak and share the knowledge, but the main objective is still to publish it in a written form in an article. Once it becomes established, then knowledge tends to make its way into books and becomes the subject of academic courses. But initially, it's mostly shared through peer-reviewed articles. In some cases, okay, we are already seeing knowledge about the domain can be encoded in machine interpretable forms, such as ontologies and knowledge graphs. Okay, this is starting to become a bit more common, but for the large majority of domains, still the common practice is that you share knowledge through peer-reviewed publications. Okay, so what's the problem with this status quo? Well, the first problem is that you generate data to validate hypotheses, and this data has lingering value. Okay, the data that you use to test your hypotheses could be valuable for other people, could be valuable to test your hypotheses beyond the original scope, for example, to to test your hypothesis or to test other hypotheses beyond your original scope. It could serve to re-examine your hypothesis when new techniques come up to validate that it's still a valid hypothesis. So to ensure both reproducibility of science and to ensure that people don't have to keep generating the same data over and over again, it is critical that the data itself is published and shared with other researchers in a way that makes it reusable. Okay, but for the most part, researchers are not incentivized to publish data. Okay, in some fields, in the life sciences, some domains, some research domains force you to publish the data, but in many cases you're not really forced to it. It's starting to be the case, and most of all, you're not forced to publish it in a way that actually enables reuse. Okay, you can, in many cases, just put it as an appendix to your journal paper in whatever format you want, and it will pass the peer review process. Okay, so as I said, for the few types of data, namely for sequencing data, the norm is already deposition in public databases. So you cannot publish a paper about genome sequencing or transcriptomics without actually putting the data in one of the established public repositories. Okay, but even in those cases, interpreting the data often requires reading the scientific publication. So the metadata that people put in the data submission is not sufficient for full interpretation of the data set. Okay. In other cases, data is an appendix, a digital appendix to the publication itself. And then good luck trying to interpret it, good luck finding it after a few years have gone by. And in many cases, you still have to contact the author if you actually want to request the data. And here, when I say data, I also mean software, for example, or a detailed methodology. Okay, for our purposes, it's all data. Okay, if you want to reuse a software or a script that another researcher used to prove their hypothesis, you often have to contact them. Okay, it's still not common practice that it will be published. Okay, so the process, if we want to reuse research data from others, is that first we need to read a publication to figure out if the data is relevant and to understand how to interpret the data. If we realize that the data is relevant, then we still have to retrieve the data and interpret it, which if it's some sort of appendix to the journal paper, it's not always trivial to do. And then we have to transform the data to enable integration with other data, because if you want to combine data from several research articles, they will seldom be interoperable, and you need to somehow figure out a way to make them interoperable. Obviously, this is not a scalable approach, okay? If you want to reuse data generated by others through this approach, you cannot go very far, you cannot explore the volume of data that is available. And that is essentially the problem, is that we have an exponential growth of data across all areas of human endeavor, okay? And part of it is because humans are also growing exponentially, okay? There's more of us, but in research, there are also an increasing number of scientists, an increasing number of research areas, so people are let's say, refining their research into more and more subfields to be able to publish, because they have pressure to publish, so they derive fields into other subfields, and you see an increasing explosion of researchers, research articles, research journals, data in public databases, research topics. Okay, all of these are growing exponentially, and this creates several problems. Okay, the first problem is findability. Okay, the more data there is, the harder it is to search and to find data you want. Okay, as the Where's Waldo example nicely demonstrates, things get lost just because there are many of them. Okay, you can hide Waldo in plain sight just by putting a lot of other figures there. And if something is not findable, it's as if it didn't exist. Okay, if you put your data out there, but don't put it out there in a way that is findable, then no one can actually access your data. And then there's the problem of interpretability. Okay, To interpret the data, if you need to read a full paper, and data is growing exponentially, and so let's say there are thousands of papers published per day just in your research field, you won't be able to read all those papers to figure out how to use the data that's there. So interpretation becomes a bottleneck, okay? And you become myopic by necessity. You can't afford the time to read the full research paper. You need the metadata to be really rich and self-explanatory to allow you to interpret the data without having to go through a full research paper. And then there is interoperability, okay? And this comes is a problem that derives not only from the exponential growth of data, but from the continuous nesting of science into subdomains and subdomains and subfields, okay? As people specialize, they have adopt different vocabularies, adopt different viewpoints on the same phenomena, and so this use of local dialects leads to standard data knowledge. Okay, and I can give you a good example of this from my own personal experience. So I do research in a topic called ontology matching, and it's also called interchangeably by the community ontology alignment. Okay. And this has to do with integrating different ontologies automatically. The problem is that for many people outside the field, they don't know that ontology matching and ontology alignment are synonymous. Okay, so we actually had a conglomerate of pharmaceutical companies called the Pistoia Alliance that wanted to delve into ontology matching. And it took them 3 years to find out that there's an annual event called the Ontology Alignment Evaluation Initiative. Okay, and they came to the community only after 3 years because they didn't know that ontology alignment was a synonym for ontology matching. Okay, and after they came to us, they realized they didn't need to invest any more in ontology matching because the state of the art in terms of publicly available tools was good enough for their use. It could have saved them 3 years of research into the topic if they were aware of the synonymous terms. Okay, and this is just, I mean, it's an anecdotal example, but it demonstrates the problems that derive from specialized vocabulary and standard vocabulary between communities. Okay, if we don't find common ground, a common vocabulary, common way to speak about things, we cannot integrate data from related domains. And this is an increasing problem because of the specialization of science. So the key issues here are that publishing data in scientific papers is not enough, okay? So scientific papers are a relic of 300 years ago when there were 30 scientists in the world wanting to share knowledge among each other, okay? When there are 300,000 scientists in the world, it's no longer an efficient way to share knowledge, okay? You cannot afford to read even all the papers in your own field, much less all the papers that come out every year. Okay, and because we value the data increasingly more than the knowledge, okay, it's critical that the data be published in a form that is findable and interpretable and interoperable. Okay, and this is the key. I think this leap has to happen in the minds of people, and if you do follow a professional career in data stewardship, you need to be able to convince researchers of this. Although they are still very much evaluated for publishing papers, the papers are increasingly less relevant than the data. Okay, it's the data that matters more, and it will be the data that will be more valued in the future. And that is a shift that is happening. So people are starting to find mechanisms to actually give credit to people who share fair data. Okay, so this is the problem, or the problems for data reuse. Now let's talk about the possible solutions. And again, I want a group discussion. How can we go about making data findable and interpretable and interoperable? How do we address these problems?
Okay, so I would dare say that each of these problems requires a different solution. First of all, I don't know if you tend to agree with this. Maybe they can all be integrated later on, but each of these problems will require a single specific solution.
Maybe.
So I would say first for findability, this is a really tough one because this has worked fairly well for life sciences because everyone looks for their data using tools like NCBI or EBI or even the DNA database of Japan. Okay, so they are all interlinked and everyone who wants to find DNA sequences knows where to find them. But these are established resources. If we're trying something new, it might be a lot harder to have a single repository that will contain basically everything.
Why do you think you need a single repository?
Well, because once you have a lot of fragmentation, if they're not replicated among each other, then data will become harder to find again.
But if they follow the same standard or something, maybe it can be in different repositories as long as you can integrate them later, even with some manipulation, I guess, a small manipulation, like data set cleaning, that sort of thing.
Sure, but I think that's about interoperability more than about findability.
Well, it's about both, actually.
It's about both? Okay.
So I don't think the single repository is really a requirement. And in fact, I've worked personally on federated data findability solutions, okay, where there are different repositories being integrated because they follow the same standard and they can communicate. The real issue is they can communicate.
Okay, so well, then it's like NCBI, EBI, and database of the
that is those two are actually a worse example of federation.
Okay.
they don't really follow the same exact data model nowadays, so that they are starting to deviate, although they do clone a lot of information between each other.
Okay.
I will say probably a unique ID, so we could always find it.
May I just add that if you want something findable, you need some kind of a map. So I think is what metadata or something like that is about. So you need a map to know where the data is in the first place.
Well, you don't necessarily need a map to know where the data is. You need the data to be somewhere that is accessible from the outside. Okay, so
yeah, but,
in the web.
Yeah, but you need to know, and you need to know how to get there.
You need so you don't need to know. You don't need to know how to get there because the search engines do that for you. Okay, Google can find out what I ate for breakfast yesterday. That's not really an issue.
That's the map, right?
Yeah, but that's not a map. That's just so search engines do that for you. They look all over the internet simply by crawling websites. They don't need a map. They just explore everything. What you do need is to actually describe what's there so that you can find it with a relevant query. Okay. Google can find out what I ate for breakfast if I describe what I ate for breakfast in words that it can understand that it's my breakfast and what is a breakfast and what the ingredients were.
So the description is the map?
Good metadata is the response in your point of view?
It's one of the responses. So you need first, as one of you said, identifiers. Okay, you want something to be findable permanent in a permanent way. So if it has an identifier today, you want it to have the same identifier tomorrow, so you can return to the same exact resource. Even if it changes, then the identifier should point to something that says that it changed in Y. Okay. But you also need a minimal metadata that describes what is there. Okay. If you don't have metadata, I mean, let's say you're searching for a specific gene. Okay. You're not looking usually by gene name unless you work with a species for so long that you already know all the gene names by heart. You typically want to search a gene by its function, for example, or to search a gene by species, for example. Okay? And so these are metadata that are associated with the genomic information. So what about interpretable?
Well, according to
I
what
think
was
for it to be interpretable, it should be at least in English, which is the language used by scientists. And in formats, well, maybe this is more interoperable, but the file should be in formats that you can open with free software.
Can a data management plan assure you a good interpretability? Could help you to understand how data are organized, and I think it can work like that, no?
So a data management plan is a useful tool for yourself when you plan your research to ensure that later, when you actually have your data, you will make it findable and interpretable and interoperable. But to actually make it work, you need to put in your data management plan the answer to the question I'm putting to you.
I will say metadata and organization, no?
Yeah, so those are key issues as well. And what about interoperable?
You know, that must be something that be understood by everyone. So universal language, something like that.
Yeah.
Or at the very least, a known language, that you know that this data is in this language or in this format, and that there is information on how to read it.
So for findability, as I said, the solution is to describe the data with precise metadata that's useful for searching. Okay, you need metadata that you actually would use to locate things, okay, to find things. Ideally, you want to use a common structured controlled vocabulary for metadata fields and values. Okay. When we look for clothing, we want to look for clothing. Okay, we don't want to look for a synonym of clothing. And so if we have a controlled vocabulary that declares all possible synonyms of clothing, when a user searches for a synonym of clothing, the controlled vocabulary will automatically convert the query to something that it knows and that is actually indexed in the data. And it should be structured in the sense that it should have a sort of hierarchy of classification to enable integrative searches, okay? If you want to search for, let's say, any genes on a specific genus, you want to get not only genes from unknown species of that genus, but genes from all the species within that genus. And for that to be possible, all the species need to be grouped under that genus in a hierarchical classification. Okay, that's a very familiar example. We all know the Linnaean taxonomy, where that actually happens, but we need the same for other metadata categories. We need the metadata to be organized in such a way that enables integrative searching. Okay, and this is something we take for granted when we use Google. Okay, when you search for a movie in Google, the reason why you get a nice vignette with a picture of the movie on the right side of your search result is because there is a knowledge graph behind Google that tells it that you are searching for a movie, and that locates a page that describes the movie, and that page then has metadata in the form of schema.org markup. Okay, so it's metadata about the web page that includes a summary of what the movie is about. It includes a link to the image of a movie, and then Google can display that as a nice vignette to you. Okay, if you search for an air flight number, it will also provide you a nice vignette about the air flight from whatever airport or company you have, and things like that, because it uses structured metadata, and because it created a metadata schema called schema.org that other websites comply with. Okay, other websites are independent of Google. They are not owned by Google, but they comply with schema.org because they want their data to be found by Google, okay, and used by Google. And so for research purposes, we have to essentially do the same. And people are actually doing the same, okay? There is a project called Bioschemas that's an extension of schema.org for the biological domain, okay? And people have been marking up their websites with bioschemas precisely to enable findability of websites and web portals about different biological experiments and biological data. Okay, and of course you need to put your data in a repository that uses persistent unique identifiers and then indexes the metadata to allow searches, okay? Unless you want to rely on Google to find the data for you. Okay, but typically if you put it on UniProt, if you put it on NCBI and other repositories, they allow searches by the metadata that they index. So to go back to our example of Where's Waldo, if we had every figure here indexed and described with their clothing and hair color, okay, we could in principle make an algorithm that identified Waldo in less than a second, okay, simply by checking which of the figures matches the description of Waldo. Okay, interpretability is essentially the same, only on a different scale. Okay, the layer of metadata you need for finding something and the layer of metadata you need for interpreting something are very different in scale and detail. Okay, for finding something you need to know, let's say, the species, you need to know the scope of the experiment, okay, whether it's a transcriptomic experiment or a proteomic experiment or just a gene. Okay, for interpreting it you need a lot more detail. Okay, you need to know exactly, let's say we're talking about transcriptomics, you need to know exactly what was compared, what were the conditions, what is the difference between the samples, in addition to knowing the species and the fact that it's a transcriptomic experiment. Okay, so to enable interpretability, the metadata should be sufficiently rich that the data itself is fully self-contained. Okay, you don't need to look at a research paper to understand what's in the data. Okay, and this can be that the data itself includes the metadata. Okay, the distinction between data and metadata is fuzzy, and we'll get to that in the afternoon as well. So you can have your data itself in a machine readable format where it includes all the metadata. Or you could have the data in a standard format and have an appendix file, let's say README, where you provide all the metadata. Ideally, you want the metadata to be structured and you want the metadata to use common structured control vocabularies, okay? And when I say common structured control vocabularies, I essentially mean ontologies, okay? Which we'll also be covering in more detail in the afternoon. And again, for interoperability, the key issue is to have common structured control vocabularies, okay, for fields and values of metadata. And common data files, some of you referenced this, are also key, but those are already well established in most domains, okay? And you should also include cross-references to external data objects, make sure that data fully references other data that is related to it. Okay, and so if we go back to the FAIR principles, what they boil down to, if you dissect the principles into a sentence each, for findability, you should have metadata with meta in parentheses, okay, because both metadata and data should be easy to find by both humans and computers. For accessibility, metadata should have a defined access protocol without authentication and authorization rules are necessary. Interoperability, the metadata should be integratable with similar data sets and interpretable by standard applications or workflows. And reusability, metadata should be rich to enable interpretation and reuse. So the FAIR data principles essentially aim at solving the data reuse problem, okay? So the reason I talked about interpretability, but I didn't talk about accessibility or reusability, is because reusability is not really is not really a problem, it's the end goal. So you want to enable reusability, and to enable reusability, you need to have findability first, interpretability second, and interoperability third. Okay, it's fully contingent on interpretability. So that's what's really at stake, being able to interpret the data, and only then can you reuse it. And accessibility is not really a concern for researchers and even for data stewards. Okay, it concerns data repositories. As a data steward, you should know which repositories you can choose. So which repositories are well established and define an authorization policy when applicable. But you don't need to worry about enabling accessibility on your own unless you are setting up your own data repository. Okay, if you are setting up an institutional data repository, then you need to worry about accessibility, but that is not really the case for the majority of people that work in data stewardship and data management. They just use established repositories. There are enough of those already for most purposes. Okay, so with this aside, let's go back to open science and have a bit of a philosophical discussion on whether to comply with open science and why. So as you discussed yesterday, open science is a movement that aims to make scientific research and its dissemination accessible to all levels of society. And this comes in different layers, okay? There is open access, which is already an established peer-reviewed publication paradigm, where the publication is free of access. So the research output, the knowledge becomes free of access. And you have, as a researcher, if you want to publish in open access, you typically have to pay the fee that enables the journal to then make it available for everyone. Open research is an additional layer. So not only are we putting our research outputs out there freely, we are also sharing data and methods freely. And the FAIR principles essentially are a specification of what open research strive for, because this is just an abstract movement, okay? Saying that you'll put your data and methods out there for free is meaningless if your data and methods are not actually findable or usable by anyone else, okay? And then there's open notebook science, which is a bit more, less consensual, let's say, that aims to put even the primary record of research, even the lab notebook, out there, so there's no insider information in science. Okay, and so these movements, open science movement and the FAIR principles, essentially reflect the recognition of research communities and publishers that we need to do something about scientific dissemination. We need to improve it. We need to make data available. We need to put the knowledge out there in a way that is easier to find. And this need has also been recognized by research funding agencies, okay? We are seeing, as we saw yesterday, increasingly funding agencies are endorsing these initiatives and demanding that you comply with the open science principles and the FAIR principles. So my first philosophical discussion is, should we be open and fair or not? Okay, as researchers or as data stewards, should we strive to comply with these principles or not? What are the advantages and disadvantages to the researcher that does this? What are the advantages and disadvantages to science? And feel free to voice your opinions.
Can I try?
Sure.
So I would say the disadvantages are probably more workload in order to do this than we are used to as researchers. The advantages of sharing data is you can get even collaborations and further results with your data, for example. And of course, to science, I think it's obvious it will advance much further if we all share our data. Also, a disadvantage we were discussing yesterday is if we share the data before our own results, we can you can have like other groups getting the results first, and then you won't have something on your own project, let's say. So that would be a disadvantage of first data put out before. And the way things are structured now, that would be a problem, I think. I don't see many disadvantages to science itself, I guess.
I would like to have that as a disadvantage. I also see the cost, because if you have to publish in open access journals, you need to have money to do that, and this is a reality. And more and more often, all the journals are moving to an open science only opportunity. So I of course I agree that there are a lot of advantages, but there is no enough support for this.
Yes, that's true. It's very, very expensive nowadays to publish. Even journals that are not so fancy are charging a lot.
Exactly.
Yes.
I wouldn't say that's a problem of the researcher, that's a problem of the funding agency. So if you have a funded project and the project wants you to publish open access, then, I mean, as a researcher, you have to foresee that and put a fee for peer-reviewed publication in your project when you submit it, okay? But that cost should be handled by the funding agency. It's the funding agency that has the responsibility of covering the costs for peer-reviewed publication.
Yes.
If I may comment on the comments, there was one very, very sharp comment that I think says it all. That someone said that there is no disadvantage or no harm for science. So then the policy and the business model and the rules of science perhaps needs to be revised.
Yeah.
That's
yes.
just my comment.
I agree with that, and I think at long term we will have a problem, because in that sense, what we'll have is that governments will have to fund all the science, because then they were also funding the journals, because they will have to pay if they want open access, and also the companies will have access to all the science that is being made, so they don't have to pay for science. They'll have it available for free. So I think the problem at long term, it will be also for science at short term. Well, it's better because science will advance with all the knowledge that you can get from the others. So you can have all the science in one place available for everyone. But at long term, I think we will have problems in funding, because the governments will have to fund everything.
If I may,
that's my view on that sense.
We should not forget that currently governments and universities and etc. pay a lot of money for accessing closed access publications.
Yes.
So in the long term, or at least in the mid-term, you would stop paying these accesses for closed access publications once most publications become open access. So you can just divert the funding from accessing the publications to actually publishing them.
Yeah, and probably the cost will be smaller.
Probably, yes.
If you currently pay subscriptions to Nature and Science, you probably will pay less if you just pay for the peer-reviewed publications of the members of your institution.
Unless you're publishing really a lot.
Yeah. But if you're publishing really a lot, then that means you have funded projects that pay for those publications.
Yeah.
I think this leads us to another philosophical question, which is, do we really need the journals? Because once everything is open, why do you need them as a middleman? So you could send your research to your colleagues and they would revise it for you and they would accept it without this middleman.
Well, the question is, well, whether you actually need a scientific article as a form of dissemination in the first place is something that I would debate. Whether you need a neutral party that actually oversees the peer review process, I think you do. Okay, you cannot send it to your colleagues because then they have conflict of interest. They are your colleagues. They are people you know. Okay, you shouldn't, in principle, you shouldn't know who is reviewing your research, at least before they review. I'm all for clarity after, but before they review it, you shouldn't know. You shouldn't be able to control who it is sent to. Okay.
It could be an anonymous committee or something like that.
Yeah, but whether you actually need to publish a paper, that's another thing. Okay, in principle, if you are able to publish both the data with sufficient metadata for interpretation and publish your conclusions in a summary, let's say a logical set of statements, for example, an ontology, you don't actually need the paper. Okay, it's essentially just a form of entertainment, a research paper. And it takes a lot of work to actually write one. You have to try to write something that's compelling and well structured, etc. And you have to cite everyone that came before you and their mother, and people that review your paper then ask you to cite their related work as well because you somehow forgot someone. And all that is just cumbersome and really prevents and slows down the dissemination of science. Okay.
I agree with that, and I think that if we manage to do everything that is being said here for the open science and open data, I think that we don't need the papers, because if you have enough data well organized and with enough metadata, you don't need the papers.
Yeah, but that raises another question, that is how do we get credits for
that
the
has
data,
to change also.
Use of the data?
I think it's something that has to change also.
Yeah,
that has to change, and there's already a group of people working on changing that, on putting pressure on giving credits for data publication and for data reuse. So the philosophy will change. People will get credit when someone reuses their data. So if you publish a second data set or a result of an experiment citing a public data set, then the person that has the public data set gains additional credits.
yeah, because usually you subuse the data that you create, that you generate. So the data can be reused in a lot of different ways, and that reusability or the reuse of the data should have a credit for the first authors or the first data collectors or the data creators. No, I don't think we can call it data creators because the data is already there. The information is created and the knowledge, but
it depends on the type of experiment.
Is only created, is only collected. I don't know.
Depends on the experiment, right? If you're sequencing, then you're actually producing the data. So you're combining things to produce data that didn't exist previously.
Yeah. Okay, but it's a semantic problem.
I mean, you could consider that the gene sequence exists. It's there, but you're not actually capturing the gene sequence. You're capturing an approximation of the gene sequence, and that's your data. It comes with an error rate. It comes with methodological issues, etc. So, but for the purpose of data, the data didn't exist. Okay, the object of reality existed. The gene is there. The DNA is there. It's a physical thing, but it wasn't data before.
Yes, but you are collecting or you are observing the data. Is an observation, and you collect the data, the information, or the sequence, the reads. So I don't know. Maybe you can.
I think
say it's a creation.
May I just? I think that interpretation is actually what gives you credit. I think the best example is how DNA was actually the idea of the DNA helix was solved, right? So Rosalind Franklin, she was producing the data, a lot of X-ray data, but she didn't interpret it, and she didn't actually realize what she was producing. So how do you come around this? If the whole goal is just to, as soon as you have the data and you have all this ontology and all this, mechanisms in place so that you can access it. So the credit goes to whom? The one that produced it but did not been able to interpret, or someone that actually found the data and saw something in that data that nobody did ever see before.
Well, there should be credit for both parties.
Shared credit.
If you publish the
that's
data,
that's a real problem right now, right? So because we don't have these mechanisms in place, no, far from it.
Yeah, but we don't have these mechanisms, but we're also not enforcing anyone to publish the data before they can publish the results of their experiments. Okay, so the open science philosophy and the FAIR principles don't require you to publish your data before you publish a paper about the data. Okay, you're entitled to have an embargo period. Okay, even if you publish something that's already mandatory to put in a public database, let's say a genomic sequence, you have to put it in NCBI or in EBI, but you can have an embargo period. Okay, the data won't become public until your peer-reviewed publication is accepted. Okay, you're entitled to that. There is nothing wrong with that if you want to ensure that you have primary access to your data to conclude your research. Okay, but let's get to that in a minute. First, let's talk about the pros to science. Okay, we already saw this. This is the whole reason why we have FAIR principles, is to facilitate data reuse and knowledge discovery. Okay, avoid wasting funds repeating experiments. Okay, an estimate from the European Union a few years ago placed the cost of not having FAIR data at about 16 billion euros per year. Okay, people repeating experiments for which data would already be available. Okay, it promotes reproducibility and impedes fake science. Okay, if the data set is published in a way that other people can interpret it, if the code that was used is made available in a way that people can reuse it, then others can easily test the claims of a research article and debunk it if it's fake science. Okay, and there is an additional advantage. So remember, the open science movement is also geared at making research outputs available to the general public. So it helps break down the barrier between scientists and the general public that I think has emerged over the last few generations. That people perceive scientists as some sort of magicians and science as something apart from their common reality. When in reality they use mobile phones and things that were enabled by science as if they were everyday objects and not even worry about them. But then other claims from scientists, they are quick to dismiss. There are some cons to science, okay? Not all data can be published, and there is need to be careful about sensitive data and knowledge that has misuse potential, okay? So if you are doing research about endangered species, the last thing you want to do is publish the location of where you found them. Okay, that's the last thing you want to do. If you are doing material research on explosives, you also don't want to publish it in any way whatsoever. Okay, you don't want people to be able to use knowledge to build bombs or weapons. So there is knowledge that has misuse potential and should not be published. And there is sensitive data that cannot be published. Okay. Due to ethical concerns.
Yeah. Comment, please.
Yeah.
This is a touchy subject. If the original data is not published, can we really say that whatever is in the paper is science? I mean, it's certainly research, but is it science? Because it's not reproducible.
Well, then one thing is it being available publicly, another thing is it being available to the peer review process. So maybe there could be a middle ground there where peer reviewers have access to the data that is underlying the research and can verify that the paper is sound, that the conclusions are sound. Okay, and the data can be perhaps published in a pseudonymized form or in a partial form that enables reuse without revealing the sensitive aspects. So, Carolina, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I want to say that regarding endemic species or vulnerable species, it might be exactly the opposite. Sometimes you need to, for example, to develop a marine protected area, you need to define where are the vulnerable species. You need to say that those species are in critical and danger, and in those cases you have to say where is the location. So it might, I understood what you want to say, but in some cases you have to actually make available that location, or otherwise you won't get support from stakeholders or from the other scientific community.
Yeah, but you still probably don't want to make it publicly available in a very easy manner. You want to share it with the stakeholders, you want to share it with the government so that they take some action on the matter, but you still won't put it on the internet in a publicly available form.
No, sometimes you do. Sometimes you publish the coordinate system, so that is very accurate. Yeah. I'm not saying that I agree, but sometimes that happen. Yeah.
So for the researcher, there are a lot of pros actually, and it takes, so this is something that you need to be able to convince your fellow researchers if you're following a career in data stewardship. They need to be able to see the advantages for themselves. Okay, the first is that if it facilitates data reuse and knowledge discovery, it means your research will have more impact. Okay, so people that have access to your research, your data, and can reuse it, that have access to your software and can use it, will likely cite your research. Okay, especially if you have papers describing it. So right now that's still the system. You need a paper describing the data to have someone cite it. But people will generally do that. Okay, and I speak for personal experience. So I've followed the principles of open science before they were actually formalized. I've always published software that I develop out there, and the same for publishing the data and sharing the data. And I'm an author of an ontology matching tool that is publicly available, and you'd be surprised by the uses that I found out that people are doing, because it's well documented, publicly available. The code itself is well documented. The tool is well structured. It's made to be easy to extend, and so we had incredible uses of the tool. So I had a student in Brazil use my tool to build modules to extend it for their graduation thesis. Okay, and I never even knew the person, and they cited me, and there's a work about developing modules for my tool for someone from someone I don't know, because I put it out there in a way that's really easy to reuse and extend. And we had a person that was actually using it from FAO, so they wanted to standardize vocabularies for different agricultural practices in countries, and the person actually gave me feedback on how I should structure my code better, and asked me for additional functionalities that they were interested in, which I complied with. Okay, and so that's an easy advantage. You can get more impact if you publish things in a way that people can readily use, and it enables networking. Okay, people often will get in touch with you, like this person from FAO. He wanted more functionalities that were not there. And so he got in touch with me, and I had a number of collaborations throughout my research career because people got in touch with me, and I was happy to collaborate with them on things I was already doing and could apply to their research. And of course, the fact that it promotes reproducibility and impedes fake science is good for you if you are a serious scientist. Okay, it rewards merit. It means that other people won't get ahead of you by publishing fake research. Okay, it puts a stop on the pressure to publish anything and everything just because you have to do it or you won't rise in your career. There are a few cons, okay, but I think they are a lot more myth than truth, except for the last one. Okay, one of you said it's a lot of work. It is a lot of work. I won't lie. Okay, it's more work than people are ready for, and it's especially more work if you only worry about it at the time of publication. Okay. Yes, Francisco.
I think there's another con here that although it's a con for the researcher, it's a pro for science, because the work that you make becomes more open to criticism. If it is reproducible, if it is reanalyzable, if your code is out there, then other people can find bugs. So that may be bad for you as a researcher. You're opening yourself to this sort of criticism, but it's good for science itself because your work is getting corrections from the community.
Well, I think that's good for you as well. You'll get better.
Well, it depends on if your paper gets retracted. Recently, there was this group that retracted 3 papers from Nature because their code had a bug. And it cost them 3 papers on Nature. I mean, they are getting better at research, but
do you really want to have research published where there's a bug that justified your hypothesis?
Like I said, better for science, worse for you as a researcher. It's a cost that you have to consider.
It depends. Worse for you as a researcher. It depends on how serious you are about your research.
True. Okay, so it's better for you as a researcher, worse for your career.
Yeah, it's worse for your career for sure.
Okay. So, but I think it's something that has to be considered, and I'm sure a lot of people are not doing this because they think they may be more scrutinized.
Yes, Ricardo.
I would like to, well, I agree with you that there is a lot of pros, but it's not only that it's just a few of cons. I think there's a lot of cons. If there was not a lot of cons, I guess all the pharmaceutical industry and other industries would do that. They don't do it. That's why. Because they lose a lot. Yeah, they lose a lot. If it was so very good for science, if they like competition, if they like everything that is so good in science, they would do it. But, well, honestly, then you need to think also in the other part. I think there should be, in general, the scientific research that is done by the public means, it's already quite open. But while the industry that is done in the industry is completely closed. So this kind of principles should be first implemented they should be the first ones to be in front of this and try to help, let's say, science to improve a little bit, because they are collecting what others do, but they don't offer anything.
Well, we'll get to that in my next slide or two.
Can I add only one little thing? It's when projects are in collaboration, especially with companies, and most of our projects now are in collaboration, so big consortiums. So I think it's a huge con to the researcher to deal with all this, because they don't know how to do it by themselves as an individual institution, but in a consortium it's even worse, because they all have to comply with open science and FAIR principles in a very integrative way. So I think it's something that no one is thinking about, I guess, because the data it's not only from one institution, it's from a huge consortium of institutions. So it is even more difficult for the researcher to deal with open science.
Okay, so I'll get to a bit more that. Let's first cover these two aspects, but let's just say that open science is not really something that applies to private research. It applies to public research. Okay. Obviously, private companies can practice open science if they so choose, but if they are funded through their own means, they don't have any obligation for that. But we'll get to that in a bit. So whether it's harder to stay ahead of the competitors if you publish your research, well, as I said, you don't need to publish your data before you publish the results and the analysis of the data in a peer-reviewed paper. Okay. But even if you do, I mean, the odds of someone finding your data and being able to reproduce your research and come to the same conclusion that you are coming, analyzing your paper and analyzing your data and publishing a paper before you publish a paper. I mean, you have to be in a very, very, very competitive field for that to be a reality. Okay, for someone to be able to find some data that you produced, you know how it was produced, you are already in the process of interpreting it and writing the paper. To think that someone could jump you by using your data, I mean, I believe there are competitive fields where this can happen, but they are few and far between. And as I said, you don't have to put your data out there before you publish your paper. Harder to make money off of research, that's a big issue. So the question is whether you actually want to make money off of your research. So are you in science because you want to get rich? I would suggest that's not the ideal choice of career. Okay, but if you are, okay, I'll credit to you. Maybe you can discover the next big thing. But this is, again, not an issue, because the societal point of view or the funder's view on open science and the FAIR principles is merely that the research that is funded by public funds should bring returns to society. Okay, and in a capitalistic society like we have, okay, we're not debating the merits of capitalism. I'm not saying I'm pro-capitalism, but I'm merely stating the society we live in and the principles that it adheres to. Okay, the way that research funded by public funds brings returns to society is that either the research itself reverts to society, so it adheres to open science paradigm and allows other people to make use of it freely without any restraint, or the research itself generates value. Okay, you create a patent, you start up a company, or otherwise create value by contributing to the economy. Okay, this is a perfectly valid and approved way of bringing returns to society. So if you get your project funded and your project foresees that you will generate patents or create intellectual property that is not to be shared because it will give rise to a startup company, no one will censor you for that in funding agencies or governments. Okay, that is a perfectly reasonable way to contribute back to society under a capitalistic system. Okay, the problem is not the people that generate patents in startup companies. The problem is the people that actually keep the data in their pockets and don't do anything with it, and it gets lost. And they are not actually interested in generating value on their own. They just don't want others to generate value from their research. Okay, and I've encountered many people that have this sort of philosophy that the data is their data. The data is not yours. Okay, if you generate the data through public funds, the data belongs to the funding agency ultimately. Okay, it's not yours. Okay. Intellectual property issues are a bit fuzzy. Typically, the institute you work in owns the data, but in practice, if you have a project that's funded by a funding agency, you need to comply with the rules of that funding agency. And these rules are that you should adhere to the open science paradigm unless you have a reasonable justification not to do so. And reasonable justifications include generating patents and defending your intellectual property, so generating revenue back to society, and also, of course, data that is sensitive or that is that has misuse potential. Those are reasonable justifications not to adhere to open science. Okay, so research that is not funded publicly obviously has no obligation to comply with open science. Okay, pharmaceutical companies are free to use public data, and they don't have any obligation to return that data unless the patent that they have on a given drug expires. Obviously, then it becomes usable by everyone. And that is just part of the capitalistic system we live in. Okay, we're not going to delve into its merits or the merits here. That's beyond the scope of this course, but as data stewards, we have to understand this, and we have to be able to discuss this with researchers that ask us why they should comply with open science and the FAIR principles. Okay, now the skeptic researcher's view is that, okay, compliance with these principles is required by funders, but it's a lot of work, so I'll just do the minimum. Okay, I'll do a data management plan over my knee, and I'll just put some metadata describing my data in whatever way that satisfies the minimum requirements, but not really worry about adopting the principles in earnest. Okay, and this is the philosophy you have to fight as a data steward. Okay, you as a data steward, your job is to convince the researcher of the merits of compliance. Okay, of the value in actually making the data really usable and reusable, and of course, also you should be able to provide solutions to facilitate the task. Okay, it doesn't mean that you have to develop solutions yourself, but you should be able to point to technological solutions. So a big issue, as some of you said, is the burden that annotating data and describing it using ontologies and all the metadata required. It's a lot of work, but there are technological solutions that facilitate this. The use of electronic lab notebooks, etc. We'll get to that in a bit. Also, as a data steward, it's your job to advise your researcher on policies that they must conform to, and licenses that they should choose. Okay. So your job as a data steward is to contribute to make data great again. And by great, I mean fair. Okay. So the recipe for making data fair is having a domain metadata standard. So if a researcher comes to you with a data set that they want to publish, you need to make sure that they follow a metadata standard for that domain. Ideally, you want a metadata standard that has an explicit data model, so you can interpret exactly how to structure the metadata, and that has a machine readable data exchange format so that the metadata can be interpreted by computers. Okay, the metadata should be described using domain ontologies or controlled vocabularies that are accepted by the community and ideally are supported by the metadata standard. Okay, some standards explicitly list ontologies that should be used for specific fields. Okay, the data itself should have established machine readable file formats, ideally non-proprietary file formats so that they can be read by free software. You need to be able to identify a public repository that has a clear access protocol, globally unique persistent identifiers, ideally supports the metadata standard that you need to adhere to, and ideally allows choice of license. Okay, allows you to put the data under the license you choose. I can tell you, not many of them allow you to do this. And of course, you need to choose a license. Okay, if we're talking about gene expression data, the metadata standard we need to adhere to is MIM. It stands for minimal information about microarray experiment, but it started when there were microarrays, but it has been extended to encompass other gene expression experiments. And it comes with a machine readable MAGE tab file format that is tabular. It lists a number of ontologies that can be used there, including the experimental factor ontology. As for data file formats, metadata would be in the MAGE tab file. Raw data would be FASTQ. And then processed data, you have tabular text files that have the read count data and the differential expression data. So these are tables of data that come in more or less standard tabular text formats. There are two data repositories that are universally recommended. If you are in the European Union, you probably want to use ArrayExpress from the EBI. If you are in the US, you probably want to use the Gene Expression Omnibus. They used to be fully interchangeable, so data used to circulate between them. I don't think that is necessarily the case anymore. And for a license, you probably want to choose a Creative Commons with attribution. So we want to be credited for your data, but you want to allow people to use it freely as long as they credit you. Okay, and how do you go about this? Well, it's simple. You describe data under the metadata standard using the domain ontologies or controlled vocabularies where applicable, and then you deposit the data and metadata in the repository and attach the license. Pretty easy, right? Well, in reality, it's not pretty easy. It's a lot of work. Okay, and it's a lot more work if you only do it at the time of publication. Okay, you have to trace all the data, so you risk losing data in the process because somehow intermediate data got lost in the shuffle. No one recorded it. This got lost, something like that. And you have to recall all the details about the experiment. Okay, and sometimes your lab notebook is not really fully detailed, so you don't know exactly what you did on day 1 or day 2 because it was a year ago. And so you risk not being able to capture all the details, and you lose some of the metadata needed for interpretation, and you compromise the reproducibility. And of course, it's very boring work to do. And so inertia and a rush to do it when you want to publish your data tend to lead to a poor job. The way to make it easier is to strive to make data fair by design. Okay, and you do this by contemplating the data life cycle from the planning stage up until publication, and making sure that you adhere to good data management practices throughout the life cycle to make sure that by the time you publish, you have all the data already structured and documented, and the work needed to actually document it for publication is a minimal addition. Okay. So good data management practices can improve research efficiency, and they decrease the risk of data and metadata loss. You should strive to automate all that can be automated. Okay, you can have electronic lab notebooks. So instead of recording things on paper, you record them electronically in a way that forces the researcher already to put the metadata. Okay, they have to describe everything, preferably in a structured way. Okay, we don't want free-form metadata. A README file that has a wall of text describing what's there is not findable, it's not accessible, it's not interpretable, it's not really useful. You want structured metadata, so key value pairs with specific fields that are necessary for interpretation and controlled values for those fields. Okay, there are other solutions. For example, at the IGC, the genomics facility requires, so if you work in the IGC and you want to submit samples for sequencing by the genomic facility, they require you to provide metadata describing the samples that you have. Okay, and the work they are doing is towards actually then integrating that metadata in a way that after the results come out of the sequencer, you can still trace back to the original metadata, and they won't sequence your samples unless you provide the metadata. And so people are forced to provide the metadata right at the start. It can be traced back from the after sequencing to the sample that was submitted, and then the metadata from the sequencer is automatic, of course, and the metadata from the analysis of the sequencing is easy to trace as well by the software tools that are used. And so this sort of approach to kind of force the researcher to submit the metadata as they do the research greatly facilitates the process and makes sure that it's not only by the time they want to publish that they have to worry about everything that they did and how. And it facilitates having good documentation.
Can I add a little detail here? Yeah. Sorry, I work at IGC.
He's an insider, so yeah.
Yeah, we actually do this with all our facilities. So we have a centralized booking system of the core facilities, which requires the investigators to fill out a bunch of metadata. Basically, you know, what procedures do you want to perform, or what kinds of cells are these, or animals, and what kind of reagents do you need, blah, 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 blah. Like all that stuff is filled out for any facility, like genomics, flow cytometry, histopathology, all the facilities. The problem here is that data, even though it exists and is linked to a particular experiment, in that system, in that booking system, it's still hard to link it to the actual data that is provided, because later the researchers just take the data, put it in the server, and then yeah, that metadata is kind of lost. So there's still room for improvement here. We can go back. We are trying to come up with solutions for this, but just to say that it's not all. It's not.
I mean,
not all
I know
wonders.
I know it's not all in place, but I had some interesting talks with Nuno Moreno where he described what he was aiming for. I know it's not still not already at present, but I hope they will come up with.
Yeah, Daniel, let me just say that it's super important that we know we have the metadata for the genomic sequence because we need it for example, for contaminant determination. Imagine that you submit a sample of X bacteria and we realize that we are sequencing Epsilon bacteria. So it's super important to have always these metadata aggregate with the DNA. And thanks for the publicity.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm not just doing publicity for its own sake. I think that's a very smart way to go about it, to force people to provide metadata, because they want to get something out of it. They want to use the facilities. The facilities actually need some of the metadata to be able to do their job, and that gets put into a system. Okay, the challenge is then, as Tiago was saying, to integrate that system with what comes out, so the data that comes out later, and have a fully integrated electronic system that traces data from the moment it is generated, and even from the sample collection to the final data products.
Yeah.
So can I make a question to the IGC colleagues? So you ask for the same metadata for people from inside the institute than from outside?
Yes, I think so. Except for a few things, I guess, like accounts that will pay for the service and so on. I think it's mostly the same. Yes.
Because sometimes you okay. So yeah, can we have access to the type of metadata that you are asking for?
I guess so. I don't see. We can talk later, but
okay.
But in principle, I don't see a problem with that, right, Ricardo?
No. For example, if you submit something to the genomics facility, you have the sample sheet in our website.
Okay.
And it's there that you deposit the metadata. Of course, then we have internal procedures, but the externals can see what we ask, what are the details that we ask for each sample, and then we have our own internal controls.
And in fact, you can hire the facilities yourself. You can use the services yourself as an external user. I think there are special rates for academia. So if you work in a university, it should be fine. It's pretty cheap anyway. So
okay, so let's get back on track here.
Okay,
I can leave you guys to chat later. So as a data steward, these are the sort of questions you'll be asked often, and you have to be ready to answer them. Okay, where to find metadata standards and ontologies. Okay, how to choose between them. There are often competing standards and ontologies in some domains. In some domains, there aren't any good ontologies, or there aren't any metadata standards. Okay, what if you want to describe something that doesn't exist in an ontology? You find the right ontology, so there's an ontology for your domain, but you want to describe something that doesn't exist. How do you use the standard and ontology? Where do you deposit the data, and how to choose a license? So these are all questions that you have to be able to answer as a data steward. And hopefully by the end of this course, you'll be ready and acquainted with most of these topics to a level where you can actually answer them. So the ontology landscape in biomedicine is complex. Okay, there are several ontologies per domain, but also domains that don't have any suitable ontology. Metadata standards are more sparse, so there are metadata standards for some domains, but not for all. And we'll talk a bit in more detail about these things in the afternoon. Okay, and few metadata standards support machine-readable formats. There are a lot of generic data repositories. Okay, there are also specific data repositories for domains, but I mean, for those cases, it's easy. If you want to submit gene expression data, you should know where to go. There are established repositories that are centralized, but in many cases, there are no centralized repositories. There are generic data repositories out there, such as Dataverse or FairDom-Seq. but they are not always compatible with all domains and metadata standards. So sometimes squeezing your data into a general purpose repository doesn't necessarily work that well, or it doesn't make the data sufficiently fair. So the metadata that they provide by default is just a shallow layer of metadata for findability and traceability of the authorship, but not really sufficient for interpretation. So when you use such repositories, you probably have to submit some metadata as an additional file to your data set. So there are a number of useful resources. Okay, the Elixir infrastructure has produced research data management kits, or RDM kits, so it should have a D here, RDM kit for short. And this is essentially a central hub with information on good data management practices. So it aims at enabling data stewards to learn the practices for different domains, for different problems, for all they need to address in their profession. So it's introductory level, but not only. If you want to find specific recipes for fair data for different domains, you have Fair Cookbook. Okay, you have implementation networks of fair data in GoFair. And as for where to find standards and ontologies, Fair Sharing is perhaps the best compendium of existing standards. It also indexes ontologies, but it's not as complete with regard to ontologies as BioPortal. Okay, BioPortal is probably the best lookup service, although the EBI now has a competing ontology lookup service as well. Okay, we talked about resources for doing data management plans. Data Stewardship Wizard and Argos are two of them. For performing data analysis and workflows in a way that is reproducible and where you can trace the metadata, you have solutions such as Galaxy or Jupyter Notebook. So Galaxy is a fully web-based interface for people who don't know anything about programming. Jupyter Notebook typically involves a bit of programming. Okay, and as for general purpose repositories for depositing documents, sharing and managing data, you have Dataverse and FairdomSeek. So these are not only for putting data publicly available, they are also for managing and sharing data. So you can, in Dataverse or Seek, you can deposit data in a way that is only accessible to you and your collaborators, and then later publish it as you desire. Okay, and there are a few commandments that you should keep in mind as data steward. Okay, first is that you should make a data management plan, and this is true even for non-funded projects. Okay, even a PhD student should consider doing a data management plan about their research. That is a question I ask often of people, is how many of them can actually continue. So if they have a lab, how many of them can continue the work of their PhD student after the PhD student goes away? Can they have a second student carry on that work? What happens to the data? Can they find it? Okay, and even your own work, can you pick up data you generated 5 years ago and follow up on it? Okay, and then the good data management practices start with allocating time after each day experimenting to document everything you did. Okay, preferably in a digital platform. Okay, and this can be an electronic lab notebook, but it can also be an online lab management software. Okay, you should document the documenting process. Okay, there should be clear rules of what you document and how you document it. What are the terminology? What is the terminology used? What are the fields used? What are the controlled vocabularies used to fill those fields? Okay, you should be able to trace versions of your documents. Okay, use some sort of version control such as Git. Okay, and for every data file or collection of data files, you should have a metadata or README file that is structured and easy to read. Okay, so this is the starting point. And that's all for me in this session. I think we have a 15-minute break.
It actually is almost half an hour. Let me check. I think we start. Let me just.
No, I see just 15 minutes here, so it's 11:30, the start of the next session.
You are right. Okay, thank you, Daniel. Thank you,
Unless there are
Ollie.
any questions, so I'm
Enjoy
happy
your
to
break.
take any questions.